My name is Munish Walther-Puri. It's very nice to be here. This talk is different than a lot of the other talks that you've been to. And part of me, I talked to the organizers because I was like, why did you accept my talk? And I wanted to come talk to this, but why did they feel like this would belong here? And it was what was at the core of what this talk is about, which, despite its title, is not actually about critical infrastructure and is not even necessarily about cybersecurity. It's about measurement. It's about impact. What are we looking at? And that, I hope, is the takeaway from you. So if you need to go, you can go now, because I've told you pretty much the main thing that I want to tell you, which is about how do you measure what happens, the impact. I'm going to use the example of critical infrastructure and cyber incidents that have happened on countries to talk about that, because it's something that I have experience with, that it's something that I struggle to define, and I want to share some of those lessons with you. So first of all, who am I? What am I doing here? Introduce myself. My name is Munish Walther-Puri. I will give the caveat that nothing I say here, I used to work for the government, a city government of New York, so nothing I say here represents the perspectives or opinions of that government, even though they're my past employer, nor of my current employer. I say that because I'm going to take some positions here. So instead of going by my titles and resume, I want to tell you two things about my background. One, it is weird and wandering and winding, and it sometimes only makes sense in reverse. And two, I've thought a lot about how does uncertainty affect an organization? How do they deal with geopolitics, terrorism, fraud, cyber investigations, the impact from cyber risk through cyber investigations, cyber risk, supply chain risk? I'm listing all those to say there's a lot of different angles to look at this, and that's what I'm trying to bring to you. So most relevant, there are my three most recent roles. My current role, I'm the VP of Cyber Risk at Exeger, where we look at supply chain risk management. And I specifically look at cyber risk. I focus on critical infrastructure. Before that, I was the first director of cyber risk for the city of New York at New York City Cyber Command. And prior to that, I led research and analysis at a dark web monitoring firm. As I told you, weird, wandering, and winding. So the first thing I want to start with is, again, not having to do with cyber, but having to do with how we think about the impact from something. We're just starting to really understand the impact from the pandemic, right? We're just starting to understand the impact from that. Let me say that differently. There's different degrees of impact. There's some over time, there's some over scale, there's different kinds of impact. Some of them we saw immediately, unfortunately. Some of them we are starting to experience now, and some of them have yet to come. Here's the important thing about that. Everyone was affected by it, but experienced the response to it very locally. Where I live in the United States, it was very local. We sometimes joke, it's a very dark joke, that in some states the pandemic didn't happen because of what that response looked like. And I say that because that was my lens at the time, and that continues to remain my lens today through most big incidents. And I mean physical, cyber, anything. And this is a bit contrarian, right? When we think about cyber, digitally connected all over the world. When I look at the lens of where it's going to have an impact to the essential services of what people are going to experience, it is local. It is every day. It is through your local government, your local experience as a citizen. That's not all, but it's many, and some of the most crucial ones. How many of you are familiar with the notion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Great. Yes, Norway. Most places are like, nope. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. What I will simply say is that I think there are two fundamental important elements about this framework. And I am not alone, by the way, in thinking about this framework and applying this framework to cyber incidents and critical infrastructure and essential services. The first is that there is a hierarchy, this before that. We sometimes struggle with that, to say this is more important. I was talking to someone here about application security. And we were sitting with someone who was working on encryption. And we had a genuine conversation of, if you have to choose between these, how do you choose where you're going to invest your resources? And you can argue about what the threats are, and you could argue about which one could be potentially worse. This is what I come back to. And this is why this lens helps. So there's a very clear prioritization. And second, you cannot address something higher without addressing the things before it. So I know that seems pretty obvious by the pyramid here, but if you are just looking at a particular area that is important and you figure out where it is, before you try and address that, what is going on below it is important. So now let's zoom out again. It's a picture of New York. One of the questions, the set of questions that I wrestled with while at the city, which is a city, as you know, that never sleeps, and so neither did I. But I also was excited to get up in the morning because this role was incredibly rewarding. I'll tell you a very quick story about my naivete before starting this role about the scale. So the first day, I'm really excited for this role, and I'd already, I hadn't fully processed what this was going to be, but I didn't have illusions that I was going to be. I went into the office; it looked like it was from like 30 years ago. I knew that was going to be the case, 100%. But I was thinking about all the different kinds of things that we would cover. Of course, emergency services, but education, transportation, and the subway in New York is pretty storied. So I came in and was talking to somebody and was like, wow, yeah, the subway. And they said, oh, we don't do anything with the subway. That's the state. And suddenly it dawned on me, and we were working for the city, and suddenly it dawned on me, like, I didn't really know what was covered. The reason I thought about the subway is because back to those two questions, some of which I really struggled with. As a citizen, what type of outage would you notice first? If the power went out, you'd know. If the trash didn't get picked up, you wouldn't know immediately. I'm not sure entirely how it works here, but maybe it's every day. It's not every day in New York. So it would take a little bit. But when you noticed, you would notice. And you would notice little else. The second question that I had was what type of, and I really tried to think about it like an outage, but what type of drop of a service would have a lasting impact, would really kind of stay with you. This was before the pandemic. So unfortunately and fortunately, I got a chance to understand the answer to both of these questions. And they were not how I thought about them. So governments deal with outages, and I'm using the phrase outage, the word outage very specifically. They deal with outages differently, but fundamentally, they're thinking about them through two lenses. One, what is the service that is being provided and to whom? That's like a two-part aspect. But what is the service that's being provided and to whom? What alternatives do we have? Of course, they're thinking about how to bring it back online. Of course. But it really is these two. Why? Because in many areas that government provides service, there aren't alternatives. So, firefighting. There's no alternative to firefighting. Interesting story, very quick digression. In Roman times, firefighting was a private endeavor. There was a very enterprising an entrepreneur. There's a lot of other terms people have used to describe, but an entrepreneur. A building would catch on fire. He had a private brigade. He would show up to where the fire was. And who do you think was standing outside that building that was on fire? It was the owner. And if the owner had the money to pay, he would put out the fire with his brigade. That's how it worked. I will not digress on long history of firefighting, but I drew a lot from that, of when did we decide to go, yeah, we all should chip in and cover this. And so something similar started to happen in New York around cybersecurity. Now you see it around a number of different governments. Not that New York was the first, but it's now much more common. So there's some key challenges. There's a lot I want to talk about with that, and I'm happy to bring things up in Q&A as well if you're curious about aspects of that. But there are some key challenges here. The first is that if we go back to critical infrastructure now, these essential services, we don't know exactly what is meant by critical infrastructure. The EU and Norway and the UK all have different ideas, but the US, Canada, and Australia also have different ideas of what constitutes the sectors. What are we talking about exactly? We all know what critical is, but what exactly it is, we struggle to define. So if everyone says critical infrastructure, we'll all kind of go, yeah. But we don't have that hierarchy, at least in an agreed upon way, which is interesting, right? It's like the nervous system of a city or a country. It's the essential functions, but we don't have any kind of map or agreement on it. The second is that this frame, and you're going to hear me talk about it more, around services instead of sectors. So this is an English language thing, whether you use vertical, domain, sector, but we'll go with sector for a second. Oil and gas, healthcare. Healthcare is a really good example of why this doesn't work. Healthcare as a service subsumes many other sectors. It includes commercial real estate, chemical, nuclear, waste, water, and of course the provision of health. So to think about it alone as just that sector is limiting. And when we talk about impact, you're going to miss some things. The third area is around that hierarchy of needs. What's relatively more important than others? Which services depend on others? We could all pretty much, like even this just room, if we just took 10 minutes and said, look, let's try and rank what we think is most important, we would all pretty much get to like power, right? Power is pretty important. You know the old joke, if there's no power, we don't have to worry about cybersecurity. So, all right, we got power. What's next? We would get into some heated debates. And I'll shortcut those debates for you because I've had them. It's about interdependency. There isn't a clear second. It's interdependency that becomes the most important. Telecommunications depends on electricity. Electricity depends on natural gas. Natural gas depends on transportation. Transportation depends on telecommunication. Data centers depend on power and cooling. Cooling depends on power. You get it. The last is that, and this part here, the interdependencies. So when we think about worst case scenarios, which is our want, right? That's our hobby, is thinking about worst case scenarios, is the cascading effect of some of these. So I'm giving you all this groundwork, not just because it's interesting, but because we have in 2023, and we will in 2024, see a lot of headlines about critical infrastructure. And some of you work in organizations that are part of critical infrastructure. And the work you're doing is so crucial in those areas that it's sometimes hard to see what is the scale of the impact. So now this point about services over sectors. I talked about healthcare, we could talk about oil and gas, we could talk about transportation. But if we look across all the set of sectors, they vary widely in the kind of technology, the maturity, the size, the regulatory requirements. But to provide a service doesn't vary that much. Again, we saw this during the pandemic. What did it take to take care of people? You needed personal protective equipment, you needed vaccines, you needed beds, right? Those were essentially the same things. How exactly that came together didn't vary. And it didn't matter what the maturity is. If you're talking about a major hospital system, a local government clinic, a shelter, a school, a prison system, those all had to provide those things. And the core idea, back to the hierarchy of needs, is to take care of that person. That's it. That was a big thing, but that's it. That was fundamentally it. We lose this sometimes in technology. What is the purpose of that technology? It's to provide that service. And this is where the government framing can be helpful because it can help you really zoom in on what that is. So focusing on those services, things started to clarify, at least again when it came to critical infrastructure, because part of my job was understanding how to identify, measure, and reduce cyber risk to the city. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but it fundamentally meant, where do we allocate our resources? Where do you spend your effort? And resources doesn't just mean money. In fact, one of the most constrained resources is attention. Where do you put your attention? And there's a trade-off in there. If you're focusing on this, you're not focusing on that. And we had to make that choice. So I tried to come to this place where we could define a threshold. What was an incident on critical infrastructure? And my thinking on this has evolved and continues to evolve because, unfortunately, we continue to see incidents on critical infrastructure. But it had three components. Number one, it directly affected a critical service, like affected that service, right? Not the space that it's in, the service. The second, it had an operational impact. There was downtime. That was really crucial. That was an important threshold. It doesn't mean we don't care about the other things, but if we're talking about impact from an incident. And the third, I won't say it's the most important, but it was something that helped us understand, and me understand, we're talking about something wider here, simultaneously impacting multiple sectors across critical infrastructure. Now we start to talk about operational technology and ICS and some of the areas where that technology, IoT, would show up in multiple sectors. And those sectors wouldn't necessarily know if they were impacted at the same time. Why would the transportation sector be talking to the healthcare sector? Like, they wouldn't. That wouldn't make sense. But there could be something affecting both of them. And then we've seen this since. So one more item about dependencies, and then I want to talk about how to actually measure this. I mentioned interdependencies before. There are four that through this work and I would put forward are really crucial interdependencies. We talked about electricity and power and telecommunications. The other two, data. So in some countries and in some jurisdictions, electricity and telecommunications are considered utilities. And what is a utility? A utility is about the provision of the thing that flows through. That's not a technical definition. Provision of the thing that flows through. I don't really care about where the water came from. I care that I can use it for the purpose that I need to drink, wastewater, clear out chemical processes, whatever it is, and that it's available. Electricity is the same way. The only time we ever think about any sort of wrinkle on electricity is like voltage, right? If you're traveling or if you're using something that draws a lot of power. Those are the only two times that you think about. Otherwise, you're like, where do I get my power from? That's it. I would argue that data is the same. Data is a utility. And I don't mean like the type of data. I mean the throughput of the data, the provision, the thing that flows through. We just need that data. So those three are utilities. The fourth is about movement of goods. You can call this cargo, but I don't want you to just think shipping and shipping containers, especially here. It can also be things like oil and gas. People don't think of oil and gas as a good, but the movement therein. Right now we're seeing a challenge in the Red Sea with shipping. I know that you all are particularly attuned to it. You understand the impact of that, but a lot of people don't. The movement of goods. These four are really crucial interdependencies when we talk about that. So I'm going to walk through this next part a little bit quickly because I want to make sure to spend time on some of the case studies. Basically, when I looked at all the services, I put them in four large categories: public safety and emergency services, public health and welfare, community services, and then financial stability and economic health. The first and last are kind of really clear, right? Public safety and emergency, you know what those are, you know why they're important. Financial stability and health, we know what those are, we know why they're important. And it's pretty clear like how they're regulated, who's in charge of them. I mean, important to put some clarity around each of those, but it was the middle two that really needed more clarity. So for the life safety, that one was just really clear. When you had a life safety issue, no question. So it's not that I don't want to spend time on it because it's not important. I don't want to spend time on it because it is so clearly important. And there's clear definition around it. The other ones that were a little harder to define were around duty of care and community and things like processing and management. The most boring things. The most boring things. But you will see shortly why they end up being really crucial when we talk about cyber incidents. Because if I could, I would go through this presentation once, and then I would go, now I want you to pretend like you are a cyber criminal. And I go through this presentation again, because I'm just giving you the playbook of the things that you should focus on to extract the most amount of value from your targets and your victims. So the duty of care and community, this one really varies, but I'm going to give you the lens that I know. It includes things like education, elections, healthcare, shelters, corrections. The challenge is that, and people really struggle with this, we don't always represent that with where the resources are. I will not make this talk about that. I will just make that statement. So now I want to get to the case studies with a few caveats. These are important. The first is that there is not entirely a clear threshold when you go from criminal activity to law enforcement, criminal and law enforcement activity, and I'm going to talk about ransomware specifically, criminal and law enforcement to a national security issue to an international security issue. Ransomware spans all of those. So it's not really a clear threshold. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are purposely below the international security threshold. So because there are very important conversations, but most talks and most conversation around critical infrastructure is around nation state activity. That's crucial, super important. But I want to look at impact. And so I almost want to remove some of the weight around motive and intent. Because when you're talking about nation states, are you talking about destruction, disruption, deterrence, espionage? That kind of can change what the impact of it is and what the MO is and how you're reading intent. I just want to focus on what is the impact from it. So intentionally in this part, I'm not going to cover Israel and Hamas, China, Taiwan, Ukraine, Russia, even though that is where we saw the lion's share of activity in critical infrastructure in 2023 and where I expect we'll see it in 2024. And if you go to other cybersecurity conferences and you hear talk about critical infrastructure, they're going to cover those areas. Part of my intent here was to cover things that you probably, I hope, haven't heard about. So let's focus on ransomware for a minute. It is destructive and has a financial impact and can be, and therefore is financially motivated, but it itself is not the impact. I know that may seem really obvious, but a lot of conversation, watch it. Watch the next time you read an article about a ransomware incident. there's going to be 1, maybe 2 lines about what the impact from it was. And that baffles me. I mean, I understand it, and it baffles me. I understand it because we're trying to understand who did it, why did they do it, what was the initial access vector, like, which gang was it? There's so much about the plot of the act, but then what happened? What was the story? How did it end? Are they still down? I can't tell you how many times I've seen an incident and been like, damn, that sounds really bad. Well, are they okay now? I don't know. What? You didn't ask or follow up? Like, how bad was it? When I talk to my community, friends, family who don't work in cybersecurity, I tell them essentially my job is to determine how bad it is. How bad is this? That's basically what I spend my day doing, right? It's like a triage. And like you prioritize the most bad. It's basically what I do. I have young kids and I have to get really simple about explaining what my job is. Figure out how bad things are. So speaking of how bad, let's try and be more precise. So there are 3 metrics that I want to use. And look, this is not meant to be academic or scientific. This is meant to be for a practitioner, because that's how I use it. That's how I used it, and that's how I use it in the moment. I could ask myself the question. As soon as I read the thing, heard the thing, somebody brought me in and said, this is happening. I can ask 3 questions. And those 3 questions are going to lead me down a pathway. So the first 2, so before I get to those 3, let me talk about 2 that we almost always discuss and are valuable, and I assume will be answered. Severity, duration. Severity is the classic, how bad is it? But as you all well know, CVSS and EPSS and all the others abound. There's lots of different ways to talk about severity, and they're not all super helpful. But okay, severity. Lots of different ways to talk about severity. Duration. This comes from incident response a little bit more. Very fundamentally, are we still dealing with it, right? Have we contained it? Have we ejected the threat actor? Are we in mitigation phase? Like, where are we in it? And this is where you get metrics around mean time to remediation. How many of you are familiar with MTTR? Yes. Okay, so you may know MTTR in terms of remediation of a vulnerability in software. There is largely in cyber resilience, MTTR, when did we get back to where we were before, essentially. Those are fine, but I find them insufficient given what we had just talked about. So the 3 that I will pose are scale, scope, and speed. And this one around speed, you may think about, we do talk about when it comes to cyber incidents, but I will wrinkle it a little bit. So the first, scale. How far? That's what I think about. How far did it go? How many people, how many assets, how many resources? And I'm going to talk about each of these in the context of a particular couple incidents. Scope, how wide? Now, this is how my brain works. You might look at those 2 and be like, Munish, those sound exactly the same to me. Far and wide to me are different. When I think width, I think domains, organizations, sectors, what I was talking about before in terms of critical infrastructure sectors. I'm talking about multiple sectors. So one is people, assets, resources, because you can talk about population, how many people are affected. You can also talk about the percentage of a particular group. So I'm going to give you 2 examples where the numbers of people that are affected are wildly different, but the percentage of the population it affected is massively different. Then you have how wide, the number of sectors, and it doesn't mean that one that affects more sectors is worse. This is a calibration mechanism. So it can focus on a particular sector, and if it's a really targeted operation, which we've seen recently in a European country, then that's definitely concerning, but you can put it on that. Okay, it was really targeted towards that sector. That also tells you a little bit about the vector, too. What was used exactly. Okay, I'm just going to say this one because it's on my mind and I can't. So in Denmark, the energy sector was specifically targeted last year. And there were, I think it was like, don't quote me on this, Sector, SEK, Tor, the cert for Denmark, put out a really fantastic postmortem. And I really wanted to cover it here, but I thought, nah, that's super well covered. So do yourself a favor, go look up that sectoral report. It's got everything that you would want. But basically, there were, I think, 16 energy companies that were targeted, and everyone that was targeted was hit. It was like a direct hit. They had very clearly found there was a particular device. I don't need to name it. It's in the report. There's a particular device, a particular payload. It landed every single time. And they only came back with one ping. That's it. It was very specific. So that isn't to say that the type of incident was bad, but it just helps me put that in perspective. Okay, so am I going to see that in transportation? Probably not. And that also tells me about the threat actor group and what they were trying to do and all of that. The last, how fast? So faster isn't necessarily worse. It's different. If there is a hurricane, it's going to have a certain impact on a city. And you have hours, days before you know that it's coming. If there is an earthquake, how many people here have been in an earthquake? Okay. I grew up in California, so I grew up with earthquakes. And when there's an earthquake, there's very little that you can do. The damage to infrastructure and to a structure of a building could be similar to a hurricane, either in cost or impact. But the amount of onset that you have, seconds? No, not really. I mean, milliseconds, all they can do is stop a train on its tracks. That's it. That's as advanced as we've gotten. And then you can retrofit a building. But so the impact might be the same, but the onset is different. So how you're going to prepare, how you're going to mitigate, and how you're going to respond is going to be very different. You can evacuate in a hurricane, you can't evacuate in an earthquake. Okay. So let me look at just time. Let me make sure we have, cool. I'm going to spend some time talking about two cases. And I did a little bait and switch on you if you read the abstract. I was going to do Costa Rica and two other countries. I'm going to do Costa Rica and Vanuatu. And I hope you'll see why I do those two. Before I get started, and I really want to calibrate here because I'm not going to spend time on things that you already have a sense of. How many of you, prior to coming to this talk, knew that there had been a cyber incident in Costa Rica? By show of hands. Cool. Also scary, but oh, cool. That means that everything I'm going to tell you is hopefully going to be new and valuable. All right. Costa Rica had a cyber incident in 2022. Let's start there. What was unique about this incident? I'm going to talk through a few things, and then I'm going to put up the slide and kind of go through them. 3 things that are unique about this incident. Number 1, it's rare that we have firsts in cyber, but it always sucks. You're never like thrilled. You're like, shit. So the first, as far as I know, was that Costa Rica was the first country that was targeted by a cyber criminal outfit. And that was the primary motive. They weren't the first to get hit, but the scale of the impact was very unique, first of its kind. That's the first thing. Second thing, it happened during a transition of political power. I'll do a little bit of a spoiler here. That also happened in Vanuatu. 2024 is going to see the most number of elections we've seen across the world in a very long time. In 2 days, Taiwan has its election. This whole talk could have just been about that. It was almost going to be about that, let me tell you, but it is not. So that's the second thing about Costa Rica. The third is that What is exceptional about Costa Rica's response is that they didn't just deal with the incident. They went a step further and said, we're going to come up with a strategy. We're going to get involved in international law. We're going to get involved in negotiations. Costa Rica was involved in some of those before. It's not like they just suddenly showed up on the scene, but they really doubled down on that. They really leaned into it. And I'm giving you that at the end, that end part first, because I want you to know that before we talk about everything that happened. Okay, so what happened? So it happened over the course of a couple months. In April, the telecom agency learns about a ransomware incident. This is important. The telecom agency learns about a ransomware incident. The Ministry of Finance was the initial target. It forces the Digital Tax Service and the IT system for the Customs Control Office offline. So let's pause there for a second. Two important things. One, they didn't learn about it from the Ministry of Finance. They had already been affected for a couple days. Two, it was specifically focused on systems that collect money. I'm going to jump back for a second because this is important. This right here, look all the way on the right, processing and management. Remember the boring ones? Those are the targets. Those are the targets. The ones all the way on the left are most worrisome. The ones on the right are the most lucrative. And that's where we see most ransomware on cities, municipalities, towns, and government functions. So that's what we saw in Costa Rica. So the telecom agency and Costa Rica's CERT, they find a post from Conti claiming credit. Conti is a cybercriminal gang. In the end, there were 27 agencies, that were affected and 9 severely. Severely means downtime. It means that it inhibited their ability to respond or even mitigate because they were just dealing with being offline. So we're not even done yet. In May 2022, a new president takes office. This is my diagnosis that a lack of continuity enabled another attack. A lot of postmortems roughly agree. No blame here, just stating fact. And there was a stolen credential from the Costa Rican Social Security Fund that enabled another attack. So now you have their post-incident and dealing with the transition, and there's another attack. I'm going to digress for a second. When I used to focus more on terrorism, we saw an evolution of attacks. And I know that Europe and Norway have had their share of them as well. But we saw evolution of tactics and timing. Tactics from very complicated IEDs to very simple attacks. Truck ramming, knives, very basic attacks. We also saw an evolution on timing, and this happened worldwide, where there would be the first incident, and then when the first responders came in and people were there was a second explosion. Particularly devastating. When I saw this, that's immediately what my mind went to. And it wasn't because they were trying to, unlike terrorism, have that kind of scale of impact. It was more about timing and likelihood of success. So then in June, the new president declares a national emergency, and they get to work trying to clean it up. Immediately, it cost them about $24 million US dollars. The cybercriminal gang was demanding $10 million. As far as I know, they did not pay. The overall cost for Costa Rica varies between $40 million and $125 million that it cost them over time to remediate all of this and to deal with it, just everything that was lost. Things that aren't included in here are the impact on individuals, and privacy, dealing with their data being exposed, all those kinds of things. So what we have here are, let's go back through. So we have severity and duration already. I talked about 9 agencies being severely impacted, and duration, approximately 2 months. But now let's go through scope, scale, scope, and speed. So scope, we have, I'm going to jump back here just so we have it. I'll go in the order here. Scale, we have how many people, how many assets, how many resources. I don't know if it was disclosed about how many. I know in Vanuatu it was. Costa Rica has a population of about 5 million. Talking about Vanuatu, 5 million. And it's hard to say what percent of that population was affected. There are certain services that you could argue impacted everybody because it was about tax collection and customs and controls, and there was a national emergency. But we do know, at least 27 agencies. Scope, how wide? So we know it hit the payment processing and permitting, some of the tax collection. Those 27 agencies, it spanned about 9 different, if we go back to this framework here, about 9 of these different areas in service delivery. Now, the ones that were more severely impacted on the right, but it affected nothing related to life safety as far as I recall, but a lot of duty of care and community. And then the last is how fast it happened. So it wasn't like hours and days. It was a matter of weeks that it happened. And the second attack was from a different cyber criminal gang called Hive. If you follow threat actors at all, there's a connection between Conti and Hive. So it had already been compromised, and some believe then resold. Initial access was resold to Hive to then exploit. The 2 takeaways from this, and I mentioned up top, then Costa Rica got really involved here afterward with their, the 2 takeaways here are, first, that those critical functions were halted. Like, they couldn't collect any money. And if you're a government, you don't have too many ways to make money. So if your primary way is halted, not only is it a source of attention, but businesses then look at that and go, well, what do I do? And there start to be cascading effects as a result of that. Let's shift to talk to Vanuatu. I'm going to ask, just because, how many of you knew that Vanuatu had a major cyber incident in 2022? Cool, no worries. Vanuatu is in the Pacific, in the general proximity of Australia. So they were offline for a couple weeks. This was another example when you saw the coverage, it was breathless. Pacific Island taken offline. But then you didn't really see when they came back online. There are 3 impacts here that I want to highlight for you. We went a little more in detail on Costa Rica. I'm going to go a little lighter on this one. First of all, Vanuatu has a population of 330,000. Every one of those people was affected. So yes, the permitting was taken offline, but so were the courts. So was healthcare. This affected across the board. Basically, everyone who had a .gov in Vanuatu was affected. They all moved to Gmail. And that's how they got business done, and pen and paper. The courts, they lost 5 months of records. I hope you've never had to deal with court, but if you ever have had to deal with legal issues, you know how important those documents are and how much that can set things back. And lawsuits are already contentious, and so now it resets everything. And the really interesting story about Vanuatu, in addition to this being, taking them fully offline, is that a couple years prior, they had basically overhauled their cybersecurity. They were in pretty good shape. as far as a country of their size and maturity resourcing can go. Full details haven't come out yet about how it happened. Again, they didn't pay the ransom. The important thing is that while they were able to recover, they definitely needed help from Australia and others to deal with the incident. And the last thing I'll say about Vanuatu, and there's no judgment here, Vanuatu is a small island nation. What do you think is the primary risk that they think about? Yeah, climate change. That's where almost all their resources had gone in terms of a risk that they assessed. So while they had overhauled their cybersecurity and invested in that, it still wasn't the primary risk that they were focused on. That makes sense. So here is what I want to kind of transition to, is that changes in resource allocation take time to manifest. So I'm going to zoom back out and talk about a few things that we're seeing around critical infrastructure. So the things that are really going to make an impact, regulatory reporting, funding, law enforcement investigations, those all take time. They take years. And we're starting to see the impact of things that have taken years. So in the US, we have a law around critical infrastructure or cyber incident reporting that is yet to go into force. You all know about NIS2. SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, regulates publicly listed companies in the US. They have a new incident reporting law. These are all great things in a way that they provide transparency on incident reporting. It's going to take time. Second, there's funding from the EU, from NISA, from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to state and local. That also takes time to come down. And then law enforcement, the reason I put this one up here and put up some of these screenshots, and I just added these the past couple weeks, is because there's been 2 huge takedowns in November and December of Ragnar Locker and Alf V, both very active gangs. It's great news. Like, high five, law enforcement. Seriously. Big. And not all victims come forward. The reason I put this snapshot up here is twofold. One, if you were at Troy's talk yesterday, you were used to these takedowns. They don't have good graphic designers here. They didn't put anything cool. They just it's the template thing. But also, there really is a whole bunch of law enforcement agencies up here. That's the first thing that I wanted to, reason I put this up here. The second, this one's from the Department of Justice in the US. So the big headline, Justice Department disrupts prolific Alf V Black Hat ransomware variant. In the press release, they're asking people to come forward. Despite having taken this down, despite this activity, this is still a huge issue and that we see. So let me jump ahead because I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. I'll come back to this. What type of outage would you notice first? What would have a lasting impact? Using that lens to think about what you should put your attention towards. So when it comes to critical infrastructure, but in your own worlds, think about what is the most precious resource. It's almost always attention or time. In the case of critical infrastructure, it might be things like, where do we defend? We can't be everywhere. We really can't. So what should we prioritize? There's things like, can we engage other sectors or other countries, or can they provide resource support? The same way we do in firefighting. There's a huge wildfire. Those other fire departments can come and support. We don't have that kind of structure yet. There are some real efforts around it, particularly in incident response. In ICS, there's an effort called ICS for ICS, Incident Command Structure for Industrial Control Systems, which is precisely doing that. As you can imagine, EU separately and NATO separately have been thinking about this in the context of Russia and Ukraine, but also engaging the citizenry and community organizations. So a lot more to talk about here, but the main thing that I want you to take away is where you decide to put your resources should be a function of how bad the thing is and bringing some nuance to how bad something is, particularly in critical infrastructure, but in your work, is an important question that you can ask. So I'm going to end there and say thank you for your time and attention. Happy to take any questions. Yes?
What is the best way to communicate impact in a big organization?
Great question. So I think every organization has its own dialect and slang and everything else, and you probably know that in your organization. And there's subcultures. And within each of those subcultures, within each of those tribes, there's currency that they value. You need to figure out what that currency is. That's how you communicate impact. So if you're working in a private sector organization, there's, of course, loss of revenue. Sure, that's easy. But it's not always the best. Sometimes loss of time, recovery, reputational risk, hit of the stock price, loss of data, compliance, regulatory burden, third-party issues that will either your organization as a third party or others. So I'm a little bit dodging your question because it's not just it depends, it really varies based on your organization, but finding what is the currency that people value and converting it into that is really crucial.
So it's important to define the scope.
Yeah, I think scope, what I was talking about, the scope, scale, and that time, because for some organizations, time is money. And if they have to spend a lot of time on something, that's painful for them. And other organizations will take their time. It's fine. Some organizations are part of industries that are very closely knit. And there's really tight integration on the supply chain. So if you're having an incident, your customers are going to feel it downstream. That's really crucial. So in that case, scale is actually more important. In others around, let's say, hospitality, scope can be important because the number of people it affects increases the propensity that someone can take out their phone and take a picture of somebody in line, and that's on social media now. We saw that with like MGM and others. Like, was that a really bad thing? No, but you saw it from a reputational and brand perspective. So it really does vary. That's why I would use those three. Good question. Other questions? Yes?
Is like paying off ransomware ever considered as an option? Like downtime, Costa Rica, Costa Rica.
Very good question. I will answer that the same way I would answer when people would ask me when I did work for the city. I'd say you can pay now or you can pay later. And paying the ransom now means you pay now and pay later. There's still going to be costs associated with it. I'm not going to pass judgment. I can and say, like, you're funding an underground economy. But in the moment that someone is experiencing great pain and they're just like, there feels like a ticket that they can just pay for, talking to them about large issues around the underground economy and fraud and how that funds other things is not really the time to have that conversation.
Are there any like successful examples of paying them off and then being the better option? Usually always seen as the worst option.
Yeah, if you extend it out over time, it's really hard to say that I haven't seen anyone make a really compelling case that over time, that was the lowest cost option. It was the easiest to execute, but it's actually not that easy to execute. You still have to hire a firm. They still have to go negotiate. You still have to manage the payment. Like, there's still a lot of stuff involved. Some of the incentives were perverted a little bit, again, at least a little bit in the US for two reasons. One, for a while, it's changed now. Insurance companies were like, we'll cover it. Just pay them so you can get the thing back. We'll cover it for you. And two, law enforcement was kind of like, we don't love that you're paying it, but please tell us, we'll go claw it back if we can. So you sort of had this like, we don't love that you're doing that, but we know it's not your fault, so just like get it done and let us know. That's evolving and changing. I don't expect that to continue to be the case. So the calculus around the cost of it, it's going to cost more than just the amount that the cyber criminals are asking for. It's going to cost you in reporting. It's going to cost you in reputational. Why did you pay? Why didn't you do this? Why weren't you prepared? Are you paying because you're deciding to pay the cyber criminals instead of paying to have better governance? Like that's the question that's being faced, that people are facing. So that calculus is shifting for sure. Other questions? All right, well, I'll be around here for a few minutes. Thank you again.